Good morning. My name is Jason McQuillen, and I'm going to be talking about the evolution of jazz styles in relation to historical events in the United States. Just some background on the way culture has influenced music over the years. Looking towards earlier American history, African Americans created spirituals to express the hardships they went through, such as slavery, and they were able to communicate their emotions to each other, and it wasn't necessarily something they wanted everybody to understand, but it was a cultural thing they wanted to share with each other. And then in recent years, as we've gone through the 20th century, artists like Bob Dylan and John Lennon have written songs that reflected cultural conditions as well. And some of them have stated explicitly what they're trying to say, but a lot of them use metaphors and different musical ideas to convey the way they were feeling. So again, if you played it for somebody in Asia, it wouldn't be the same as somebody in the United States hearing it. And other artists in other genres, such as NWA and the Sex Pistols, have also used their music to convey different things, different kind of emotions, so it can be sadness or anger or happiness that people are trying to reflect, but a lot of it's based on the cultural conditions that these people are going through. This brings us to what is jazz. And jazz was developed in the United States in the early 20th century, and it's considered to be uniquely American because it developed in the United States and spread throughout it and has primarily American influences. Jazz was heavily written and influenced by African Americans and their experiences, so similar to the spirituals, it's expressing their emotions, but with more music and instruments rather than lyrics. And a quote that I found from the Harvard Gazette was, "Jazz's ability to resonate with people in times of deep sadness or carefree happiness stems in part from its ability to harness and transcend time, to capture a moment and build on it." So a lot of people that wrote jazz and experienced it felt that it really had the ability to capture these emotions that people were going through and writing about. Jazz originated in the early 20th century, but mainly in New Orleans. And what's significant about this is that in New Orleans there were a lot of diverse populations that included people from African, French, Caribbean, Italian, and German descent, as well as others. So a lot of different cultural backgrounds and different hardships people would face were being mixed, and people were talking about it, and they were able to bond over these hardships and create music that reflected their emotions. And since its origin, jazz has gone through a lot of stylistic changes, which is what I'm focusing on primarily in this presentation. The gap in knowledge I found is that there's been a research on artists such as Bob Dylan and the different music that has been written about historical events and how it's affected the United States, but there's been little research looking into jazz and other forms of music that don't have lyrics, so it's harder to see how they connect to the events. And another thing I was looking at is that there wasn't a lot of research over time. So there would be research about songs that were written in the 70s, but not from the 1900s to the early 2000s. And there's also uncertainty regarding how jazz styles have changed and why they changed that way. We just know that they did change, and there's been a lot of changes, but not exactly why. So this led me to my research question of, is there a relationship between changes in jazz styles and historical events in the United States? The methodology I used for this was a mixed methodology, because when I was looking for it, I couldn't find something exactly like I was doing, so I based it off several papers that I found and how they conducted their research. Part of this was a correlational research method to look at the correlation between jazz styles and historical events in the United States using the dates of those events. And another part of it was the meta-analysis research method to analyze the pattern in the data over time while looking at multiple sources. I wanted to summarize the jazz styles before we went into this so it would make sense. And some of the key styles to understand, one of them is swing, which is dance music. And it wasn't necessarily meant to be complicated, but it was meant for people to enjoy and dance to. Another one is bebop, which is similar to swing. It happened right after swing, but the melodies were more complex, and it lasted for a shorter amount of time. Swing was a main form of music for about 15 years, whereas bebop only lasted about 5 years. And the next important one is free jazz, or avant-garde, which is free form, and it lacks preset chord changes or structures, and a lot of people considered it a radical approach to music. And the last one is fusion jazz, which has jazz elements fused with rock and funk. And it's the most aggressive and loud form of jazz that's more like rock music rather than swing or a traditional form of jazz. So using the sources I looked at, I created this timeline of about when the jazz styles occurred and the periods they lasted. So there wasn't a lot of overlap in the styles, because when it was happening, once swing started, nobody was really listening or creating New Orleans style jazz. It was a lot of swing, and then there was a lot of bebop. So as you can see, over about 60 years, there were a lot of changes in jazz and how people were expressing themselves. So some key points in history that I looked at too were in 1929, the Great Depression started, which affected the whole United States. And I thought this was really important to look at because of how American jazz is. Something like the Great Depression would have a big effect on it. And in 1932, FDR was elected and the New Deal was about to launch, and he was planning for that. And in 1945, World War II ended, which is another significant event because it was the second of the world wars, and after that people were able to stop thinking, okay, we're at war all the time and we have to worry about this. And another important one I looked at was in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, and just the increased advocacy for civil rights in general, because a lot of the people that were creating jazz were African American, and they were facing a lot of this in the United States. And then also in the 1970s, protests against the Vietnam War, because again, it was a large thing that was affecting US culture as a whole. So here's my timeline from before, but I put the white dots where those events that I talked about previously happened. So as you can see, a big one is this, which is the Great Depression. And what I thought was interesting was swing isn't sad music. So it's not like people were going through the Great Depression and they were upset and they were creating sad music. They were creating music that was easy to write, but it was fun. So they were going through economic hardships, but they were able to listen to this music and play this music and dance and have a good time even though they were struggling. And this one is when FDR was elected and we were starting to plan for the New Deal and get out of that. And as you can see, some of them, like there's the Great Depression and then swing happens right after that. And that happens with a lot of them. Some of them are right there, but these are approximations, so it's not exactly, and some of them happen right before. And then with fusion jazz, that one is when the Vietnam War protests were happening. And something interesting about that is because fusion jazz was loud and aggressive, it was protests that people were angry about. So they were feeling like they could use this to express how frustrated they were, and it really reflects in the music. So some of the limitations of my presentation or in my research were limited time. So I didn't have a lot of time to find sources, and something I really struggled with was printed sources. So I couldn't go out to libraries and find the books that I was looking for. Another one was resources, like I mentioned. I couldn't find a lot of the printed sources online because they just weren't accessible. And a lot of the jazz that was happening wasn't recorded until the 70s, so there wasn't a lot to listen to, and people weren't writing about it, they were just listening to it as it was happening. Another limitation is lack of experience, because I've never really dealt with looking at something like this, so while I researched it, somebody who's more experienced could provide deeper insight into this problem. And then there's a lack of clarity when distinguishing between styles, which is also on my timeline. I had the approximations because nobody can say, you know, in this date in December, that's when swing started. So the conclusions I got from this is that there's a possible relationship between jazz styles and United States historical events. Some of them are more strong than others, and that's why I say possible, because the Great Depression happened and then right after that swing started, and it shows kind of a clear relationship, but other ones it's not as clear and you can't really tell what event pushed that style to happen. Another one is that drastic changes in style could be instigated by political and social climates in the United States, such as the Great Depression, that like swing was a drastic change that happened and chose fusion jazz because a lot of people didn't agree with it, and you can see that that was instigated by these changes. And another, not so much conclusion I came to, but just problem that should be looked at is the difficulty to distinguish between the styles and make concrete connections. And for future directions, I think because of some of the limitations I talked about, jazz should continue to be researched, and it should be researched as a historical art form, because these days all the new jazz that is being written is a combination of different styles of people trying new things, but there's no new style that's happened like swing that's that impactful. So we can really look at it from a historical perspective instead. We should also be researching broader relationships just between culture and music, so it doesn't need to be jazz, but it could be any form of music and how it relates to culture. And just analysis of like specific songs and patterns, something I didn't really get to go into because it would be an in-depth way to look at it instead of more general, I think would be beneficial when looking at this in a historical context. And that's it.
Good job, good job. All right, got some questions for you.
Okay. What was the most important source of information you found while conducting your research, and why was it important to the process?
I don't think I had one source that was the most important, but when I was creating the timeline of the styles, I used a lot of sources to try to make sure that it was unbiased and that different people were agreeing on when they started. So I don't think I just had one that was very important, but it was many of them that created the whole overview of it to get away from the bias.
Okay, so my question for you is, what additional questions emerged during your research? Based on your recent experience, what advice would you give to other researchers who might choose to investigate those questions?
The main question that emerged was, how can we distinguish between the styles, as I talked about before? And the advice I would give would be just to look at stuff specifically, unlike I did, because it was a very general overview, to look at the specific songs and what was happening to see if we can create something more concrete and say, this is around when it started instead of within these few years. That's, kind of when it started.
Think about the initial curiosity that led to your inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might the same curiosity lead to?
The curiosity I had was kind of just towards music and culture, and I leaned towards jazz because I knew about it and I liked it. But I think it could have led to looking at any kind of music in any kind of time frame to see how it connected to the culture. So people could have done maybe music in Europe and what was happening in Europe, or anything like that.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.